Oh, that's my stuff.
Yes, so thank you for coming to our project working groups for Digital Humanities Methods. Today we're going to try to get much more into detail on how we can move forward with projects. So we're going to talk about some really practical questions like, project management, funding, working together, what resources we have access to on campus. But first we're going to hear a couple examples of projects. So I'm going to kick it over to Amanda, and she's going to tell you about her DH project. You guys please write your names on the sheet of paper for me, just that you were here. I don't even really need your email addresses, just write that you were all here in different handwritings.
All right, so I'm working on this project that we've titled Decolonizing Memphis, although I would also maybe call it Indigenizing Memphis. I've gone back and forth a little bit between the titles. And originally when I thought about this project, I had imagined recreating maps, geographic spaces, collecting stories, narratives of the people here and the communities that exist here, but in a way that made Indigenous peoples the authors of this content, the generators of these sources, the gatekeepers of knowledge, essentially. And then eventually I wanted to add the narratives from people who immigrated here, too, to sort of add this layer of Memphis as a crossroads. Ultimately, we imagine this being part of a larger project that I'm working on with some people in the community called the Mid-South Indigenous Alliance, in its barest beginnings, just to be clear. But we ran into a couple of roadblocks immediately. One being, what does it mean to decolonize something? I think that word has been tossed around a lot, like it means diversity, or like it means democratizing sources. And so we're really trying to combat that a little bit. I mean, certainly a decolonized space has more diversity, and among other things, in equity, but that's not what it means to decolonize. So decolonizing is pushing back, it's creating something new to replace an existing structure. And then how do we do that then in a digital humanities space when often the education generation is itself a tool of oppression? And having access to computers and digital space is also sort of something affected by colonizing processes. And so then how do we take a project that wants to decolonize when we are acting it out in what are inherently colonized spaces? So I don't know that I have an answer for that part yet, but I've been working through it a lot in this process, and what I think that means, and how really not to perpetuate colonial influences by doing this. So one of the things we decided to do is study more about Indigenous epistemologies and then how to bring those things into this project. And again, we're just starting. I think that our first step is going to be to maybe re-examine the narrative of how Memphis came to be, sort of re-examine that Jackson Purchase story and what that might look like from a Chickasaw point of view. I think our second step would be to take a number of there are like 1,200 Indigenous people in Memphis, to be honest, right? So not a significant population, but they have created like an Indigenous Memphis tour. And so I think we want to take that and make it available and digitize it and add some more narrative and stops on it to put that at the forefront of this. And then maybe look at where the people who were here before, who were not part of the colonizing process, like where did they go next? Like where did the Indigenous populations that were here go when they left? And then eventually, maybe like next year, we'll get into the immigration side of this particular project. But I think that's where we're going to start. I will say that this project instead has sort of become a touching point for people who are interested in decolonization of their existing organizations. So I just went and spoke to the Memphis Performing Arts Coalition for one of their diversity summits. I've been to 2 other things like that where people want to talk about decolonization, they want to talk about land acknowledgements, they want to bring Memphis into this conversation that's happening, mostly in Canada, but is beginning to happen here. And then we've been invited to a couple of other places to talk about what decolonization work might look like for other social justice organizations. So I'm thinking like a layer of this project I had not really anticipated might be creating a digital space for people to come to when they do want the tools to work on decolonization in their own projects. But yeah, so that's what I'm working on right now. And I know that I was supposed to keep to 3 minutes. I hope that worked.
That's great. Thank you so much. Okay, and the next project, Kyra.
All right, so my project is on Tension of Correspondences during the Revolutionary era, and this is actually like an offshoot of my dissertation where I am looking at European discourse on the botanical craze, so the love of botany, and it started in the French salons during the 18th century, so it goes from the 18th century to the 19th century, so when I say revolutionary era, I mean 1750 to 1850, just to have like a 100 years to work with. And even though I'm a French historian, I'm also looking at correspondences between French intellects as well as German intellects, and also British intellects, and even people in the early America, so North America primarily, but also I'm thinking about adding the South American component. So what I'm mostly interested in is looking at the correspondences of European intellectuals who traveled between Europe and what we consider the New World, so the Americas, so North, Central, and South America, and looking at big name figures such as Chateaubriand, Alexander von Humboldt, Paul Buffon, and then seeing who they talk to. And not only looking at the people, like the well-known people, but also like the lesser-known people. So we have a good way to compartmentalize the information of those correspondences. And one of my chapters is looking at how do these people talk about nature? Is it only from the scientific perspective? Is it from the religious perspective, aesthetics, things like that. So it's still a work in progress, so I don't have much to add other than I'm talking about also them not only writing about the plants, but also bringing the seeds from the Americas to Europe. How do they showcase the flora to the European audience? And also why gardens, so talking about the exotic gardens. And I have a tab for major figures. There's a list of 12 people so far. The list might grow, but I might just keep it from 12 to 20 just to keep it manageable. That's it.
Thank you. And then we have a visitor from CBU, actually. Kevin is going to tell us about the project he's working on. I'm not great with PowerPoint. Do you know how to open this? It's a PC, so you have to click.
Sure. So, thanks so much for having me. I'm in the very early stages here, but I got Melanie's email that this was a good place for getting feedback, and I'm eager to hear your all thoughts. So I'm venturing in my second project into statistical analysis for making sense of literary style. And it's maybe not a great time to do that, judging by the recent debate in the Chronicle, where statistical analysis in literary studies is a little bit under attack. But I want to introduce my project real quick, and then I'm, like I said, eager to hear your thoughts. So I study the early modern period, and I'm particularly interested in transnationalism, transnational religious identifications, and how that impacted literary history. And in the project that I've recently started, I'm looking at literary translation of religious material, things that crossed through French and German and Dutch and into English. And this part of the project focuses specifically on Du Bartas's Protestant epic, which was really popular in England and Scotland. And probably the most famous translator during his day was Joshua Sylvester, although he's largely kind of a footnote in literary history. He's been forgotten, despite the fact that he was considered something of the poet laureate in the early 17th century. And in Sylvester's translation of Du Bartas, he makes his claim that Du Bartas was really English even more in heart than in language, right? He belonged to the English in some way more than he did to the French. And I'm interested in what impact Du Bartas's style had on English literature, kind of whether we can see this in some sort of quantitative way if we use data analysis. So like I said, I'm only in the very early stages of talking to other digital humanists about ways we might start quantifying literary style. But Du Bartas in particular seems to have a kind of style that lends itself to this, right? So his work is heavy in neologisms, for example. He has a lot of compound adjectives. There's a lot of alliteration. There's all of these quantifiable bits about his style, which was part of what I think made it fall out of favor so fast. If you read Duartas or his translators, it's this very kind of ornate and overwrought style that by mid-17th century no one was writing or reading anymore. But I'm interested in whether we might find ways to kind of measure its impact, its forgotten impact, on English literature early in the 17th century. So just from conversations with other digital humanists, there are a few ways that I've started considering and exploring. And one might be something as simple as a spreadsheet of these different characteristics that could then be applied to different databases of English and German and Dutch literature. So looking specifically for these very quantifiable habits in this style of writing. There also are simple tools like Voyant, right, that might let us get a bit deeper into the lexical peculiarities, but it seems like for this examination of style, we might not have to do anything too complex. And then the last thing that I just started talking to people about and exploring, and interested to hear if you have any thoughts, is the idea of treating style as distance and using topic modeling to start getting at this kind of difference between how Sylvester is writing as opposed to other writers in the period, right? Can we conceive of literary style and differences in literary style as a kind of numerical distance that can be measured? Not entirely sure. For English, I think the database that I'll be using is the EVO DCP project, which is large. At least the first part of it is free and available now, so that certainly is useful. But I'm also curious to kind of, like I said early in this project, to see if people have any suggestions or experiences for working with databases in French and German literature. It seems like from what I know in my research, there's nothing quite as centralized and unified as the EVO DCP project. So thanks so much again for letting me present briefly.
Does anyone have any comments or questions? I think there's Artful, but you have to pay, yeah, in
Yes.
French.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Those are three examples, I think three really good examples of the kinds of projects we have on campus. And certainly, the kind of the correspondence networks that Kyra is working on, I've worked on similar things. I think we have other people working on similar things. Stylistics is definitely of interest to people in multiple departments. And then, of course, the kind of, I think, Amanda, the kind of partnerships that you've sought out of people on other campuses, and even some local nonprofits. That's the sort of thing we want to be doing. So that's why today I wanted to have this conversation about how we can move these sorts of projects forward. Because I think collectively we have a lot of knowledge about people, experts in the area, who might be able to help other projects, grants, how to make connections with people in the area. But sometimes it's very difficult when you're just getting started. So I think pretty much we have two groups here, history and then sort of language analysis. Yes, that looks right. So I have a couple of slides, if I can get it out of this, okay. Going through some questions to get started, but of course the most important thing today is for us to have a real conversation about our projects and where we want to go with them. So I have these questions as suggestions. Obviously, if you guys find other things to talk about, feel free to wander as far as you want from that. So first, I suggested just brief introductions. A lot of us already know each other, but maybe we know each other more in a social sense. So just really going through and listing some interests that you have related to digital humanities. Some of us have primary research interests that are not related to digital humanities, but we might have other research interests that people aren't aware of at all. And so I'm just going to give you guys around 10 minutes to get to know one another and sort of maybe any project ideas that you have, things you've thought about doing that maybe other people in the group don't know about yet.